And let's be fair, I mean, these have come on in leaps and bounds. When this first shut down in March, I think we were all looking there going, what the hell are we going to do for the next, for the next several months with meetings? And it's been amazing how some of them have evolved, trying to be more or less complex. The virtual meetings that people have tried, those have been a bit more tricky, and then the simple stuff like just chatting on Zoom with a few people. So we might be able to get better at that, but it's going to take a little bit more thought, isn't it?
This episode was made possible with the support of Medtronic Aortic. Aortic disease doesn't stop. Neither do you. That's why now, more than ever, we're committed to offering virtual education, off-the-shelf solutions, and unrivaled support. Medtronic Aortic, your partner in the evolving healthcare landscape. Navigating change together.
Hello, everyone. It's great to have you here this podcast virtually. It is my distinct honor to have Steve Black on this program with me from Guy and St. Thomas's Trust in the UK. I'm Kush Desai. I'm an interventional radiologist from Chicago in the United States. And for this first in a set of podcasts that is going to give us a global vascular perspective, it's going to be Steve and I holding an informal discussion about really the matters at hand, which is shifting tides and how education specifically, we're going to talk about vascular education, how those shifting tides have moved a very in-person, interactive environment through a multitude of meetings that happen throughout the year into the entirely online virtual forum in a quite abrupt manner. So we're going to talk about what our perceptions of it are, what we think the attendees' perceptions and industry's perceptions of it are, and how we can grow and what we think the future holds for us. So, Steve, it's great to have you. It's always a pleasure to do these programs with you. And let's just start off by what do you think are some of the benefits of an online virtual platform for learning?
Kush, really great to join you on this podcast. I think we've had a great time chatting over the course of the last few months, and it's very timely, I suppose, to talk about these education issues that we are currently facing. So, the benefits for faculty and attendees, I think the biggest benefit has been the ability to continue to provide education and online learning and continue some of the themes of topics that were lined up for many of the meetings without the ability to travel. So that sort of option of continuing, I guess, has been important. And I suppose the second benefit, which you would talk about, is the ability to join so many more meetings than perhaps we would have been able to otherwise, with the constraints of travel and the impact that has in your practice. Because for most of us, we can dip in and out of a meeting while still continuing to provide a largely normal service around that, which is both a good and a bad thing, I would think. But those two factors, I think, have been the most important.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I'll tell you that my wife and my children are much happier that I'm home. I'm sure yours are the same. But it's great for attendees to be able to pick and choose what they want to listen to on their time. And that, I think, it was always available, but certainly not available in the breadth that is available now that everybody is completely online, where if somebody wants to listen to, for example, what Steve and I do, which is a lot of venous disease, specifically deep venous obstructive disease, if they want to listen to a talk on iliocaval interventions, they click the link. They don't have to necessarily wait till a certain part of the day, and they can do it on their time, evening, morning, between cases, or at lunchtime. So that's I think one of the big positives of moving into the virtual realm. But what I wonder is, are there compromises being made by being entirely virtual? I'll start by saying that I think that I lose the in-person interaction not only with colleagues like you, Steve, but I lose interaction with attendees. And I think we've talked about this, and certainly you can elaborate on this more. There's a lot to learn just from informal conversations that I'm a little concerned that we simply don't get, at least not adequately or in the same manner, in an online forum.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we had a recent chat about that at quite some length, because for me, as a faculty member, and I suppose the difference is for faculty versus attendees. As a faculty member, some of the best aspects of meetings are the ability to chat to people like yourself, or somebody like Nick Haas, or Tony, or Steve Elias, or Jerry O'Sullivan, or Mark Meisner, or any of the people that we spend time learning from. But you have those conversations at the end of your talk, in a corridor, or perhaps over a beer, or perhaps at dinner, where you learn, and I've learned a huge amount about how to treat my patients better, and where the differences are in the subtleties of how we engaging with our colleagues or engaging with patients. And that's been tricky to see how we replicate that. And I think the same applies to attendees. There's oftentimes I'll do a lecture, and at the end you'll have 4 or 5 people who are waiting to have a chat about some stuff, maybe a patient they're treating, things that they couldn't just bring up in a fully open forum. I think we've seen that from some of the podcasts and learning we've done now, where that the question time, or the ability to have those off the cuff comments have not totally been replicated yet. And I wonder if we can start to find a mechanism of doing that in a more tangible way.
That's a good point. We've all been in that position where somebody pulls out their phone and says, "What do you think about this case?" And there's not something only for the attendees, but for us, because I certainly have been in those scenarios. And he says, "Well, here's how I approach it." I was like, "Well, that's interesting. I would have never thought of that way of doing it, but it's a good way to consider it." And you can either say, "Well, here's why I don't think I would do it," or, "Well, you stumbled upon something, or, either knowingly or unknowingly, that I think is very useful, and we can bring it back to our practice." And you almost wonder if we need some sort of moderated virtual online forum for question asking. And we haven't seen that in an organic matter, because right now question and answer in these online sessions is largely at the end, and people raise their hands, and then the moderator or the technical person behind the scenes is letting them into the chat room to ask their question, or they're typing it in. And it really just isn't the same. No,
it's not the same. And I think the difference is when you sat in a room full of people, and you can see who's around you, who may be answering questions, or people are waiting their turn, you get a sense of how the flow of the conversation is going. And I found that often moderating talks as well, you can pick out people and get them to answer questions, which has been a bit more tricky. But I guess that's about us learning how to use these platforms. And let's be fair, I mean, these have come on in leaps and bounds. When this first shut down in March, I think we were all looking there going, what the hell are we going to do for the next, for the next several months with meetings? And it's been amazing how some of them have evolved, trying to be more or less complex. The virtual meetings that people have tried, those have been a bit more tricky, and then the simple stuff like just chatting on Zoom with a few people. So we might be able to get better at that, but it's going to take a little bit more thought, isn't it?
It is. The one thing I also get concerned about is the quality of education. And we all know that interactive education is the best because it's problem directed. Patients or participants bring up their problem, they ask a question, then there's a banter back and forth on the panel. And quite frankly, sometimes it's worth much more than the didactics that precede it, right? It says, well, here's how I've been doing cases for 20 years and you're presenting this way of doing it, and why should I listen to you? And then there's a thoughtful discussion between 4 people on a panel. And that simply is, and then the whole room of 90, 100, whatever number of people benefit from that discussion. So how do we do that? And there are probably ways to do it, but I think, Steve, you have really said it best. We are social creatures. And so I think that when all of this has blown over, we will in some way, shape, or form go back to being in person. And we'll discuss that more in a couple minutes. What I wonder is also, what are the other intangible losses that we've come across? And the first one I want to bring up for consideration is, future informal that go on to become very formal studies and research opportunities that, are not being generated at high levels in universities or grants or at industry, but they happen between 2 or 3 KOLs, if I can use that word, and then they say, well, that's a good idea, and let's make something of it. And we don't have that opportunity, do we?
No, I think that's definitely changed things, and I'm struggling with how we replicate that for sure. So if I take a look at a bunch of the studies that I've been involved in over the last several years, and some that are upcoming that we're trying to set up, and we both involved in Clear DVT, Kush, and if you look at the timeline on that study and how we got that off the ground, a lot of it involved informal meetings between ourselves and not only Boston Scientific ultimately end up sponsoring it, but also the various members of setting that study up were at meetings. And what meetings provided us with was one, a fixed point at which we would have to see each other to resolve issues. So you kept things moving forward. 2 was that option for face-to-face informal conversation, and particularly when there's some difficult things to resolve, sitting in a room and thrashing it out, you get a sense for where people are. You can read their faces, you can see what people are upset about or enthused about or engaged with, and things that they're not engaged with. And that face-to-face personal contact helps you to move discussion forward. And I think it's a little bit with podcasts is a bit like drivers who start to get road rage. If you're sat remotely from people in a room having an awkward conversation, I'm not so sure you're going to resolve it in quite the same way as you would if you were sat in the room in front of each other. And I think that's going to be interesting to see how we keep those bigger things that for me were so important with meetings, the board meetings, how we build those back up in a way that actually helps us to support this sort of stuff.
Well, that's a great point, because if I can make a metaphor, it's like almost the difference between sending an email and then giving someone time to think it through and answer, or instead of getting the first gut reaction, which is often lays bare how they truly feel about something. Or entirely ignore you altogether and it get buried in the thousands of emails that you and I get every day. So, there's something very real about being in person and saying, like, look, you said this about the endpoints for the study. Let's just as a point of discussion, and I disagree with that because it's not going to happen at my shop. And then you come to a compromise, and that compromise does not happen over email without a lot of extraneous noise. Not impossible, but a much slower process, I would think.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that there's hopefully a new study that we've finally got over the line, and this has taken us probably a year and a half of multiple meetings to get it to the point where it's virtually ready to go. Not virtually as in the virtual world, right? But virtually as in we're almost good to go. And that took what I found about those meetings were, if I reflect on the process. We had a face-to-face board meeting where people got a little bit heated, maybe a little bit upset about stuff, and everybody bantered through. And when you're in a big room, the loudest voices often dominate, so you'll get the sort of stronger speakers talking. You can pick up from the body language which people are not quite so happy, who may not be on board. And then the follow-on from that meeting is you have about 45 minutes to an hour where you're wandering around just catching individual people and going, you seem bothered by that. What's up? Let's work through it. Let's talk about that. Let's solve that problem. And that kind of that follow on. And then at the end of that time, you've pretty much got a good handle on where you need to go to set the next stage. And we don't have that. That sort of, even if you can replicate the first stage of a board meeting, the subtlety that comes with building consensus and building a group of people to get them unified, I think we're gonna have to work hard to get that right. Over the next several months, for sure.
No, I absolutely agree. If we shift gears a little bit to how this has impacted industry, from our perception as frequent faculty at these meetings, industry, not only in terms of our ability to collaborate with industry, but from seeing the latest and greatest new technologies. Meetings are frankly where that information is disseminated. It's not hard to see that. That's why industry spends considerable amounts of money to advertise and promote new technologies at these meetings. And let's just be honest, not being able to hold a device at a booth or in a workshop, hands-on workshop type of scenario, it really, I think, compromises uptake and penetration of new technologies, wouldn't you say?
No, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think you and I have similar experiences of having, provided advice to several people on products and as they develop and so on. And that stage of holding it in your hands, playing with the product, playing with the delivery system, just getting a feel for what it's going to do is irreplaceable. And I think the quality of feedback will suffer from that. And I think also for our industry partners, it's the same thing as that there's informal conversations that happen out with of the meeting or around the booth or afterwards at dinner or whatever. There is I can see that online learning is much cheaper to deliver, and therefore the cost may come down, but actually the cost was related to some of that benefit that you got from their real presence at a meeting of all that stuff that happened in the background. And I'm sure we'll find a way to do it, but I think that's why, if we start to think of the days of in-person meetings over, and that certainly has been mentioned, I can't see that will be the case. I'm sure that we will start to find the value of in-person meetings will come back again over the course of the next several months.
Yeah, and truthfully, I don't think there really is a way to replace the hands-on. I know we had mentioned this as a discussion point. There really is no way in a virtual environment to replace hands-on. Whether the closest approximation you can get is local representatives bringing in device or prototype device to high volume users, and then perhaps having recorded material that they have on an iPad or a tablet or something of the sort on their end, and saying, well, here's what they've thought about it, and why don't you get your hands on it and let's have feedback and let's discuss what you think about it. And it isn't quite the same as being in Las Vegas and holding the device as we would be at Viva, but it's about as close as we can get in the current environment. But one other thing I wonder is, how can we improve the interactivity between us as faculty and a group of people that have questions? And one idea that I've kind of bandied about with a few people, I think we've even discussed it, is something where attendees can bring their own cases that we then discuss. And, it's in a very non-judgmental way, but this is how I've always found these conversations in live meetings to be amongst the most fruitful, that I had this patient, and then everybody benefits from the experience discussing that patient's care.
Yeah,
so
I think that's right, Kush. It's if we think of some of the best meetings that I've had have been meetings like Expert Venous Management in New York and run by Steve and colleagues there, where I've learned the most from those sort of informal discussions around patients, not only my own, but everybody else's, when you present your own difficulties. And I think it's important to recognize that, you may stand on the podium and be recognized as a KOL or whatever that means, but we all struggle with patients. And we all struggle with sharing ideas. And actually, in some respects, there's differences for people where you perceive to be an expert in it. You get more complex things, and that makes the problem solving harder. And actually, that sort of breadth of discussion that you have in those sort of meetings is important. So I think how can we foster or improve things? And this also ties into will virtual meetings replace everything? I think if you get a good blend of virtual meetings where people don't necessarily have to travel and the meeting is broadcast live, so you increase the number of people who are going to be able to log in and see it, but you have a component of faculty that are there together with some audience members. I mean, it's a bit like watching a chat show on TV. You watching the chat show, there's a live audience who are interacting with the people on the stage who are sharing ideas, but far more people see it. And I think that sort of virtual live meeting combination will probably work to address some of these things. But I think that moving away from didactic lectures and minimizing those instructional lectures that have been the mainstay of meetings over several years. A bit of stuff that is science-driven, where we're presenting new science and new research, and a lot of stuff that is focused on decision-making on patients with real examples from both audience and other participants will be, really powerful. And we now have the technology to allow us to record videos very simply, to edit them ourselves, to have these sort of bits and pieces together that will add to that.
Well, this actually feeds right into what we wanted to discuss next. Are the days of the in-person meetings over? And I think everyone that's listening probably realizes that Steve and I certainly hope that they're not, and because there are just some things that cannot be replaced in an online-only environment. So we'll move forward, and I'm certain we'll have in-person meetings because, as Steve has said it best, we are social creatures, and we need in-person interaction, and there's subtleties that you simply do not get over Zoom or Teams or whatever it may be. But one thing that might benefit if we discuss a little bit more the idea of sort of hybrid meetings, which there is an in-person component and a virtual component that people can tune in. Some were already doing this, but I think that it's going to happen much more. And the benefit of it is you can have a truly global audience. So, for example, a meeting like Charing Cross, for example, may have a much more global audience and much larger uptake in the United States by having a robust online platform. What did you say, Steve?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it was testament to the success of some of those meetings is the Charing Cross online platform was very well received. And we've seen that from a number of other meetings where, the number of people, I think for Vein Symposium, there were 1,000 people a day logging in. And you can't get that sort of attendance live. It's expensive for a lot of people to travel. And I think it's going to get more expensive to travel because the airlines have been so hammered by COVID. I can't see that we're going to be able to have the options that we did for those low-cost budget airlines. I mean, who knows how many of them are still going to be in operation at the end of it. So I'm sure that if we can find a really robust blend of both. I mean, I have to say, to your point earlier about your family being so much happier that you're around, normally I'm charging around like a lunatic and I'm flying back and forth to try and do all sorts of things, and that's all stopped, which has been great. And I think we've got to find the right balance between it because there were undoubtedly too many meetings. So if there's some sort of, and actually that's been exposed now by the online type of platforms, there's practically something going on every single other weekend at the moment. And now that people expect that you can just attend any time, it is becoming quite hard work, I would have to say, trying to keep up with everything. So we do have to rationalize meetings to some extent, and I think that would be helpful too. Yeah,
there are too many meetings, and so if this means that some meetings go some smaller congresses go every other year, that way you have fresh perspectives, but they're on twice yearly or every other year basis, as opposed to being annually, then it keeps things fresh and it permits in-person meetings to happen. And then you have the hybrid approach of these online meetings. For example, my exposure to an IR meeting in Europe, CIRSE, is very limited. But now with an online presence, as they've been forced to pivot to, as all of them have, I can see myself being much more easily involved and listening and interacting in CIRSE, which was not typically something that had a very large online presence, at least certainly not one that I was aware of.
No, it did not. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And you can imagine that being able to literally interact with all of continental Europe and get an entire group of providers from different countries, different practices, different exposures, different patient populations to us here in the United States is incredibly valuable. And I think they would probably feel the same way about our SIR meeting, which is once a year, that if they do have a very robust online presence, then they can have access to content that, frankly, they've never had access to before, unless they flew here.
Yeah, well, no, quite. And I think the same applies to Asia and Australasia. I mean, it's, prohibitive to come all the way from Australia or Africa to most of these meetings, not only from a cost perspective, but from a time and traveling. And, you get that benefit of having meetings later in the afternoon in European time, sort of 5, 6 in the afternoon, which is really evening in Asia and early morning in the US, where everybody can tune in at the same time. And I think, those aspects of meetings are really good. So you may find that the online component of a meeting or the virtual part that is broadcast is put into different time zones. So you're not having the whole meeting broadcast, but you specifically have an hour's session that is loaded up to be online and interactive with some form of live moderation of questions and how things come in from people all over the world. And we're going to touch on a lot of those things in our podcast as we over this series as we go through things that are impacting the States or Asia and Europe more specifically. But there's lots of common ground. And if nothing else, if we can drive some more standardized approaches to patients across the globe, we're going to do everybody, not only ourselves, but specifically our patients, a favor by moving the discussions forward on things like appropriateness of care and the best treatment options. It moves so fast now. We can really help facilitate that.
And that's what I think is great about this series of podcasts that Steve has put together with Radcliffe, that over the next several months, you're going to get a truly global perspective. And I certainly will be listening to all of them, and we'll be incorporating items from prior podcasts into each one that I end up producing, just to have a common thread throughout the entire thing, that we're all in this together. This is a truly global phenomenon that we're in the midst of right now. And in a funny sort of way, it's bringing us together to really kind of think out of the box and rethink how we approach education and care of patients. It's not simply how do we do it here in the US? Well, I heard that this is how they do it in Australia, how Ramesh does it in Australia. I know how Steve does it in the UK, and it's really not too different, or there are stark differences, and we can improve what we're doing and vice versa. So there's, I think this couldn't come at a better time, this set of podcasts. So Steve, I'm going to ask you in our closing couple minutes here to put on your Nostradamus hat, and let's see if we can predict how we come out of this COVID-imposed, pandemic-imposed quarantine, and when we can be in person again. When and how do you see us emerging from this in terms of in-person education?
So it's really tricky, isn't it? I mean, a lot of what happens with COVID seems to be tied into: do we have a second wave? Will we have a vaccine? When are we going to be able to go back to something approaching normal? And there's so many variables in it. For me personally, it's trying to manage the patients who've now been on hold for 6 or 7 months, who we need to treat. So there's a big your day job burden of work that needs to be dealt with, and then continuing the education and training. So I personally think we're not going to be anywhere near normal in the next year. I know a lot of meetings are now trying to set themselves up for February, March, April, and hope that we're back to normal. I personally think that's optimistic. I think if the winter predictions of second and third waves are right, we're going to be struggling to have confidence to travel. Hospitals are going to impose restrictions on large group meetings. We're still not allowed to attend any meeting which is going to be a large group of people joining together, because obviously the impact for a hospital if a whole bunch of people have to quarantine for 2 weeks is enormous. So I think we're going to have to see those things change. So I'm looking to the end of 2021, 2022 to start going back to face-to-face meetings in the sort of scale that we got used to of Link, Viva, VEITH, Charing Cross, those sort of big meetings where you had 4,000 or 5,000 people all together in the same place at the same time. And in the middle, we're going to find a middle ground of how we start to build those back up again. And it might just be smaller groups and this balance that we've been talking about today of a bit of live presence of the faculty, broadcasting to groups of people, smaller audiences, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you couldn't have said it any better. I mean, I completely agree. I think it's optimistic to think that we are going to be in person at large congresses in the early part of next year. There are just far too many variables. One, the city or the locale hosting it, the policies of your hospital and university that will probably impact a very large percentage of faculty from even attending, not to mention attendees. And then on top of it all, just the stark reality of the politics of entering and exiting countries where COVID may be at a different point of the curve. So you're absolutely right, Steve. There's going to have to be not only a vaccine that we can trust, but probably one that has somewhat broad penetration before we are looking at in-person meetings. I was hoping maybe late next summer, but I think that's probably optimistic at this point. It's probably going to be 21, 22. But I like your idea of being able to get a few people together in something that is permitted by our bosses to then deliver interactive vascular education where 4 or 5 of us are together in a room, and then we can do smaller meetings and to an online audience. I think that's a natural next step to sort of bring back some of this interactivity that we've been missing.
Yeah, I agree totally. Well, Kush, it's been great chatting. I think I'm not sure we could have added much more into that discussion about where we're at and where we're going, but I'm just grateful that we've been able to continue some form of online and virtual education. And it's funny, all these things that we were slightly nervous of have become natural. Even doing this blog on Zencastr, we've managed to find a way to upskill ourselves in a very short space of time.
That's right.
So it's been a phenomenal learning experience.
Absolutely, Steve. It's always a pleasure. I look forward to doing many more of these with you because we frankly will have to, and we're getting better at it. and thank you everyone for listening. Please stay tuned as over the next several months from Radcliffe, there is going to be a truly global perspective in vascular education. And I think all of us are going to try and have a common thread so that listening to each subsequent episode is almost like a continuation of prior episodes. And we're going to try and do something along those lines. So again, Steve, thanks for being on, and good to chat with you. And we'll see you for the next one.
Thanks, Kush. Take care. Bye-bye.
This podcast was brought to you by Radcliffe Vascular and is sponsored by Medtronic. To view the series, head to radcliffevascular.com/vascularPODCAST. You can also find us on all well-known podcast platforms and follow us on Twitter @RadcliffeVascu. Thanks for listening.